All right, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to go over, we're going to discuss a different kind of connection from a transcendental connection, right? And so this is basically necessary, I feel, to set up the whole idea or the framework of influence type psychic abilities, right? So like I said, we're going to have to talk about some different things that don't really apply to sensory type psychic abilities, right? So to go over this first point, so it says, with a transcendental connection, your ability to sense or imitate a target increases over time, right? So we talked about that, right? So your transcendental connection it's a transcendental mental ability, and it has the ability to charge, right? As you charge it more, your subconscious imitates what you're connecting to. So if you charge spiritual energy, right, you're transcendentally connecting to God, and your subconscious charges in such a way that it alters your behavior to imitate the behavior of God or behave in the likeness of Jesus Christ. And when it comes to sensory type psychic abilities, when you charge a transcendental connection, right, your ability to sense the target increases. So that's what happens with a transcendental connection, right? It can be relatively weak, right? But as the connection increases, your subconscious increases in its ability to imitate the target or sense it in the case of psychic energy. Now, when we think about the connection, the general connection between the body and the subconscious, does it make sense to think of that as a transcendental connection? So, for example, we recognize that if I produce an intention, right? Let's say it's at the anxiety frequency. I produce an intention that causes my subconscious to switch to the anxiety frequency. We know that my body will, if I produce an intention that says something's a threat to me, right? And not a mild threat like the danger frequency, but a higher threat level, right? So we talk about that in chapter 4 of book 1. If I produce that intention, my subconscious switches to a different frequency. My body reads that frequency and responds with the primal emotion of anxiety and starts commanding my subconscious to charge up the anxiety frequency. So that happens very quickly, right? It happens very, very fast. Similarly, we know, so we talked about how your subconscious also expresses itself in the form of sensing. We talked about how sensing at the subconscious level or through your spirit can occur involuntarily, which is the spatial form of sensing, and voluntarily, which is sensing in the mind, right? And you can control that. Now, the involuntary form of sensing is completely relegated to your body, at least in a more advanced way, right? So you do have a normal level of involuntary sensing. We actually talked about that in the last chapter, which is sensing in the spirit. That occurs at a very weak level, but the main way it occurs is through the body. Now, does it make sense to say that that works in the way of a transcendental connection, right? As in, the more you connect to your body, right, your ability to sense things involuntarily or spatially increases over time, or the communication between your subconscious and your body increases, and it decreases with time when that transcendental connection weakens. If we were to kind of use that same framework to talk about the general way the subconscious and the body communicate, it doesn't quite make sense, right? It's way too fast, way too sturdy to be compared or to be the same thing as what we were talking about with transcendental connection, right? Because with transcendental connection, for example, sensing something, it started off very, very weak, right? And then it increased as I charged more psychic energy, right? Basically, I would never really be able to sense much in the spirit to that degree of clarity, right, without charging. So it also doesn't make sense that the communication between the body and the subconscious should be so fast, right? So if I should produce an intention and my body responds immediately at some frequency, or it responds in some way to my subconscious, it doesn't change, it doesn't go up or down or things like that, depending on how connected I am to my body. Like it's so much more sturdier than what we've been talking about with a transcendental connection. So, but at the same time, we know the subconscious and the body must be connected, right? They must be connected in order for all of these things that I'm talking about to happen, right? So in a nutshell, in order for my theory, the framework of my theory to make sense, we have to recognize that what we've been talking about in terms of transcendental connection, that can't be the same as the connection between the subconscious and the body that we're used to, right? That we're used to for everything else we've been talking about between the subconscious and the body. Basically everything we talked about in book 1. And so basically, just to go over this first point, which I kind of went over, but I'll just read it anyway. It says the superfluous communication, or interaction between the body, mind, and subconscious is far too quick and far too sturdy to be explained by a transcendental connection, right? So the normal way that the subconscious and the body interact and communicate, like I said, basically everything we talked about in book 1, it doesn't weaken or increase in strength or weaken at times depending on what we're doing with our intention. It's always super, super strong, and it allows our subconscious to communicate very quickly. It's not subject to what you're thinking or what's going on in the environment. Even when you're dreaming, it's still there, right? If someone taps you when you're dreaming, you wake up very quickly. So that's still the subconscious communicating. Your body sends a command to your subconscious in the form of sensing something, and your subconscious responds, and you wake up. And so that connection is very sturdy. And so what is this new connection, if not a transcendental connection, between the subconscious and the body? Well, to go over this here, the main connection between the mind, body, and subconscious is what I call your silver cord connection. So that's a different connection between the body and subconscious from a transcendental connection. So that's very important. Now, the reason I call it a silver cord connection is because generally a lot of people who have astral projected, or I believe it's happened in some cases in a near-death experience, they'll actually see a silver cord connecting their spirit. So they're having an out-of-body experience. In this case, they're in their spirit, and sometimes you'll see a cord connecting their connecting their spirit and their body. Sometimes it'll go like into their stomach. Sometimes it goes into their head, or I think maybe even their chest in some cases. But sometimes they'll see a silver cord. So that's basically where I get it from. The silver cord is considered to be what sustains life in your body. We're going to talk a little bit more about what I think the definition of life is, which I'm kind of still developing. We'll talk more about that at the end of the chapter. But your subconscious also has a definition of life, just like it has a definition of truth. So we went over truth in chapter 4. In this chapter, we go over the definition of life, which is basically related to Jesus, right? But I'll explain that a little more later. But in a nutshell, the silver cord is considered to be a connection between your spirit. So your spirit has life in it, and that silver cord connects your body to your spirit, so your body has life. And then when you die, that connection the cord is considered to be cut, right? So your spirit dies. Your body dies. It has no life in it anymore. But yeah, so that's basically just where I get the term from. But ultimately, your subconscious has the main connection, the main thing that allows your subconscious to communicate with your body so quickly, and what allows that connection to be so sturdy, right? Basically never changes no matter what you do. It's always a very strong, very quick, very fast connection. That occurs through your silver cord connection, right? So very important. So why is that whole thing important in the framework of this new theory of influence type psychic abilities? Well, to go over this next point, it says the way your intention quantizes the subconscious to influence the body through the spirit depends on the type of connection you're using. So in a nutshell, let's say I hold an intention to influence my body in some way, which we'll talk more about how that works later. But let's say I'm using I hold an intention to influence my body. Let's say I hold the intention to heal my body. What's actually interesting is my subconscious will respond, and it's going to start trying to heal my body. But the way it responds is going to be different depending on which connection I'm using, right? So if I'm using a silver cord connection to manifest or carry out that intention, right? Because that involves a connection between my subconscious and my body. I'm going to get a certain type of response out of my body, which is generally going to be a normal or related to a normal influence type psychic ability, which just means it's not transcendental. You're not charging it, right? This is just stuff that happens every day. So if I hold the intention to heal my body, you probably would actually see very quickly, right, certain changes in my body. So this is nothing like supernatural or highly metaphysical, this would just be related to generally the placebo effect, right? But even if I hold it within a minute, right, you could probably see some change in my body or brain as a result of that intention, right? So that's going to occur through the silver cord connection. Stress as well. If I have a negative thought, that's going to make if you have precise enough instruments, you could probably measure certain changes in my body that say, oh, he's probably thinking a negative thought, right? His body shows some degree of stress, even if it's not very intense. So basically, those normal type of changes, which we see every day, those occur through your silver cord connection, right? Now, the more supernatural, transcendental ones you don't see every day, which you only hear about in rare circumstances in history, right? Those would occur through a transcendental connection. Now, transcendental, you might think, well, don't you always have a transcendental connection to your body? No, right? So that's very interesting, right? But the answer is no. And the reason you don't, we're going to talk more about it later, why that is, right? But you would always have a silver cord connection to your body. Yes, that's very strong, very sturdy. That's the one you generally use for everything. But a transcendental connection to your body is completely different, right? So you do have that to a degree, but not to the degree of using an influence type psychic ability in a transcendental way, right? Or basically using chi energy in a transcendental way, which we'll talk more about that later. But yeah, so that's why it's basically important to recognize that there are two types of connections your subconscious has to your body, right? It has a silver cord connection and it has a transcendental connection. The silver cord connection is generally the one that science looks at. And they can't really explain that anyway, because you would still need the theory of chi to understand how that works. So they generally have no idea how the placebo effect works because they don't recognize this stuff. But when you start controlling your chi in a more transcendental way, then you would have to explain it using a transcendental connection. You can't really explain in terms of a silver cord connection. So yeah, that basically, again, set this up just to set up the framework for the theory that I have on influence type psychic abilities, the way they work, both inside and outside the body. I should also mention, I think it's pretty obvious, but I should mention when you can't use normal chi inside the body. At least, you can't use it outside the body, at least not in a significantly noticeable or measurable way, I think, right? So if it's outside the body, generally you're always going to be using a transcendental connection for chi, using your chi for something outside the body. But if it's inside the body, now you have the option of a silver cord connection, which that's just going to be a normal influence type psychic ability, right? So yeah, that's pretty much it. In the next video, I think we're going to talk about the relationship between influence type psychic abilities and transcendental control. So I have to look at it, but it's going to be something. The topic is going to be somewhere around that idea, right? But yeah, that's it for now, though. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.